Hey y'all, how's it going? It's Sway, and today we got our first big balance patch since spells have come out. Patch 28.2.3 came out today, and although I feel like this is probably one of the healthiest, start of metas we've ever had before, there are a lot of adjustments that we have to talk about, so let's go. As per usual, we will be discussing Battlegrounds here, but if you do play Constructed, I will be dropping the patch notes in the description for you to read yourself as well. First, we're going to start with the very spicy Tae'thelan. Now, we saw Tae'thelan get removed because he was just too good. So, we saw a big change here where the hero power now costs 1 less on the spell instead of costing 0. This is going to be really, really massive, but honestly, probably really good considering how strong Tae'thelan was. Up next, we have Lich Baz'hial. Lich Baz'hial's hero power now costs 2 instead of 1. I'm a little bit concerned about how much this is going to impact Lich B. Of course, not so much in demon lobbies as usual, with the Soul Rewinder being able to negate that damage, but for 2 whole gold, taking damage and spending 2 gold, that's a lot of detriment, so I'm not sure how much of a nerf this is going to be, but it feels massive. Up next, we have a very specific hero targeted here. We have Niuzao. There's a specific text wording for the fish, and it is now where it dies in combat. So no longer can you do the Kel'thuzad on tier 6 Phalanx situation where you just load up your fish with Phalanx buffs. So if you didn't get to do that, I'm sorry. But if you did get to do that, I'm also sorry. Up next, we're seeing a little bit of an armor change as well. Murloc Holmes, Togwaggle, Zarella, and Crag all have been pretty heavily nerfed. Now, this makes a lot of sense, especially for Crag, because Crag was at a very high armor tier considering the one-time use hero power, but now with that spell that allows you to swap your hero power out, Crag has gotten so much better. For more armor, we have Tae'thelan, which makes sense as that hero power got a lot worse just now, as well as Lich B, same situation, and Professor Putricide. And now we're moving on to our minion and spell updates. First is Whelp Smuggler. Whelp Smuggler has been insanely useful because of the very low curve dragon end of turn build, as well as the Sandstone Drake with the Master of Realities, insane buffs. You just play 2 Whelp Smugglers, Sandstone Drake, Master of Realities, and watch the scaling happen. It's really crazy. So now Whelp Smuggler has seen a pretty sizable decrease in stats from going from a 2-5 to a 2-3, which is going to be really massive for that board liability spot, which I talk about every now and then, where it's like this minion creates a better situation for these other minions that are large. However, I'm going to have this one minion that's really small and potentially couldn't trade into something and remove it. Still a super decent card to run, but at what cost? Speaking of those end of turn dragons, we have our bronze Sandspewer. This is also seeing a stat line reduction, going from a 2-2 to a 1-1, creating that board liability space until you really start getting those 7 minions going, which sometimes you're playing this minion simply because it's a divine shield and you're not really getting it going for a turn or 2, maybe even 3. So unless you're playing a hero for a tendency with wider boards early, this is a very sizable nerf. And continuing with those end of turn dragons, we have the Nether Drake. Not only is this a stat line reduction of -1 health, but also it now says your other dragons. So that means that it no longer buffs itself, creating yet another board liability space. Albeit end of turn dragons were very strong, so these nerfs do feel kind of needed, but it is a lot at once between so far the Whelp Smuggler, the Nether Drake, and also the Sandspewer. On the other hand, it was very annoying to take that damage so early, and now this is negating the situation where all of a sudden these very large dragons appear on your opponent's board and you take so much damage so early. Continuing on the dragon train, but this time, I mean, it's still an end of turn, but not that beginning of game end of turn. We have our Ignition Specialist. This is a massive stat line increase, going from a 2-2 to an 8-8, but also jumping up a tier. So now on tier 6 lives this dragon. I have said this before, I'm not sure that I've said it here, but spell generating minions are so good right now, considering how important spells are to the game. So this is a very massive change considering it's going all the way up to tier 6, making it that much harder to find. But before it was like a board liability spot being a 2-2, now it's an 8-8, so it doesn't feel so bad to triple into as a 6, but it does feel bad to take so long to find it. That being said, I think that this is a very necessary and very good change. Speaking of minions that generate spells, Mystic Sporebat is also jumping up a tavern tier. Mystic Sporebat is not nearly receiving the same stat line increase is just going to a 5/1 from a 4/1. However, it is going up to tier 4 from tier 3. It was easy to want to triple into tier 3 when beasts were in, considering you could hit a Sporebat, and the tempo that you get from hitting a Sporebat can be so beneficial. But now going to tier 4 and the stat line that it's at, it does feel a little bit worse to triple into, but still a very useful unit. And the difference between tripling from 3 into 4 is not that big of a difference. I don't think that this is a negative change. I think it's a very good, impactful change. This particular minion I was very much not expecting to see. It's the Sprightly Scarab. Lots of interesting changes happening here. It's going from tier 4 to tier 3. It's going from a 5/2 stat line to a 2/1 stat line, so no longer any kind of just, oh, you know, I don't want to waste this gold by selling, so at least I have this 5/2 body on the board. Now it's a 2/1 body on the board. And it changed mostly for the fact of giving +4/+4 taunt now to +3/+3 taunt. The +1/+1 reborn is still just the same. And I'm not gonna lie to you, whenever I'm looking for a thing to create a taunt, I never ever think of the Scarab. I know sometimes tempo is incredibly important in this game, and this being on tier 3 and giving a 3/3 stat line is pretty good, but I don't know many people that use this for taunt, so I was very interested to see this on the list. That being said, maybe we'll see it being used to give taunt more? Not sure, but one thing I am sure of is that I'm very glad that the reborn on it has not been touched. And moving right along is our next minion that generates spells. This is the Spellbound Seafarer. This did gain 1 health point and did not change tavern tiers like the other 2 spell generating minions, but it did increase after you buy 4 cards instead of 3 cards. So it's not as regularly creating, but I mean, when you do you kind of get going, you get some strike oils, you get enough money to create a good situation for yourself in that later part of the game. When you find the Spellbound Seafarer anyways, you should be able to proc this at least once a turn, I imagine. I know I personally have had many times where I just haven't been able to even have enough hand space for what the Spellbound Seafarer has to offer, so I think that this is a really good change. And going right down the list, we have our Trembling Trolley. This change is incredibly similar to Spellbound Seafarer. It does go from a 0/9 to a 0/10, so we increased 1 health point, and it did get 1 increase on the Avenge, so it went from Avenge 3 to Avenge 4, just like Seafarer went from buy 3 to buy 4. I think that this is a very needed change for this card. I do think that Avenge 3 is incredibly low for getting spells, and you do get some good generation, especially when beasts are in, undead are in, mech are in, so I think that this will work just fine. And it still has that 0 stat line, so it doesn't attack, and you're just hoping that your opponent doesn't hit it and you get all the value you can. Next on our list of nerfs is one of my favorite new minions for obvious reasons. We have Lighter Fighter. Lighter Fighter is going from a 5/1 to a 4/1 and dealing 4 damage instead of 5 to the lowest health enemy minion twice. I know 1 health doesn't seem like a lot, but this 1 damage that's been removed from each of the attacks, leaving 8 total instead of 10, with 1 normal proc, can make a really big difference. As much as I love playing this minion, I do think it was a little bit problematic. Little more than a little bit, and I think that this is going to be a really important change to see to this Lighter Fighter. I think maybe 1 more nerf in its future. I'm hoping not. But that being said, I really love this minion. It's a mixture of Kaboombot now as well as Dr. Boombox, and Kaboombot is just one of my favorite minions ever. Next up, we have a pretty sizable change for our little friend, the Hummingbird. Even though the stats stacked with the 2 Hummingbirds, so both of them did end up getting the attack, it was kind of nice to only have 1 with the 0/5 because the beasts ahead of the Hummingbird would have the chance to attack and then die, and the Hummingbird wouldn't attack, so if anything didn't die, it would have the opportunity to then. But this time around, if for some reason your beasts ahead of the Hummingbird don't die, the Hummingbird will die because it will attack with that 2 attack. I'm not sure actually if this was on the nerfs or buff side of the teaser from yesterday, but this is a really interesting change and I'm not sure what I think about it. Next up from our beasts, we have Niuzao. Niuzao gained +1/+1, going from a 6/5 to a 7/6. A +1/+1 stat line is nothing to frown at, and I think that this can make Niuzao a little more viable than it currently is. Niuzao is a great removal tool, and if your opponent is running something where maybe you want to try to target the back of the board, sometimes Niuzao can help with that. That being said, this is not a major buff, but it is a buff enough that I'm hoping that it does some stuff. Next up, we have our Bazaar Dealer. This is our new demon that does basically what Malchezaar does, but with spells. We know how beneficial these health for gold situations can be, especially and even if you're willing to sacrifice that health without a soul rewinder, but especially so with a soul rewinder. So Bazaar Dealer is not seeing a major change here, but it is going from a 3/6 to a 2/4. So pretty sizable stat line decrease. And we know that it is a little bit harder to buff demons. We have like our Mind Muck, we have our Tychondrius at the top end, which you could triple from Bazaar Dealer into Tychondrius, but you know, overall not super easy to buff this, and this could be just kind of a weak spot on your board for a little while. But that being said, it can be very, very beneficial to get you one more spell, and if you're willing to even sacrifice 4 or 5 health depending on what the spells look like in your shop, it can be very useful. I think that this is a great and also necessary change. Staying on the demon side of things, I think we're seeing more or less a revert to the Imposing Percussionist. I'm not sure exactly about the stat line, but I think I recall Imposing Percussionist used to be on tier 5, then moved to 4, and is now going back to 5. I did not fact check that, so I'm not 100% sure on it, but I do know for a fact right now, at least, it is going up to tier 5. I'm a little concerned about the aspect of tripling into 5 and hitting an Imposing Percussionist, especially if you're not playing a demon build, and tripling into a 5 is a pretty big leap. I don't know why in my head I'm like, okay, tripling into 4, you know, doable. 5, whoa. But it does feel that way. So we'll see how this works on 5. I do think that with that brand spell on 4, it's going to be a good change, but we'll see. Up next, it looks like we have a nerf buff to the utility drone. It is going from a 6/7 to a 4/5, so pretty massive stat line decrease there, but giving +2/+1 for each magnetization. And I know that in previous meta, it was pretty strong. You know, those Giga Mech builds were very prevalent. And I don't feel like they've been so prevalent anymore, but I think this might create a little bit of a resurgence, especially with those like, you know, I really downplayed the Drakari spell, the Brand spell, the Rivendare spell, all existing on 4, because for one turn I was like, wow, this is kind of expensive, but sometimes they can be really helpful. And imagine tripling into a 5, getting a utility drone, having some magnetic, and then playing an end of turn spell. Even though it's not going to be lasting, like you're not going to have a Drakari on your board, it could be just enough of a spike to be able to push you up a tavern tier without having to worry so much about taking massive damage the next turn. Next up on our buffs, we have, I don't know why I want to call this minion Old Faithful, but we have this Swampstriker. And it's Old Faithful, I guess. I think this minion just maybe hasn't been like very affected like by nerfs or buffs, so maybe that's why. But it's a 1/4 going to a 1/5, maybe making it feel a little bit better to play. It's kind of hard to get rolling on Murloc. We know when Murlocs start, they snowball, but there's not a lot of play in the beginning of the game for Murloc, so hopefully this will change that. Continuing on this Murloc train, we have the Heedless Hoarder, or I like to call it the Ball of Murlocs. This is going -1/-1, so it's losing a little bit of stats, but it is going to tier 3. And I mean, I've had many a meme dream with this card. Like, I've really wanted to cycle them and make a very massive hoarder, and I think I did it once. It took a lot of effort, but maybe on tier 3, this can become a viable strategy again, especially with Scourfin existing on 3. I think that this could be a really fun build, and I kind of would like to focus a little effort on it now with this patch. With that being said, I hope that this going to tier 3, I think it already immediately to me feels a lot better, and I'm hoping that this is a good change for the all of Murlocs. Next up on our Murloc train, we have King Bagurgle. Bagurgs is losing 1 health in the actual body of the minion, but is giving +3/+3 now instead of +2/+3. So we already saw a little bit of a buff to Bagurgle, and now this is even more of a buff. This is a great Battlecry minion to play, and even though it's on tier 5, it does not feel so bad, except for tripling into it feels a little bit bad. But aside from that, it does feel like a great minion to play to buff your board. I was really hoping for some Quillboar change. Quillboar seem a little bit disjointed right now. There's some discard effects, which someone in chat at one point brought up a great point that sometimes you don't want to change your hero power and you get the hero power spell from another avenue like the Ignition Specialist or something, and it's just taking up a spot in your hand, so the discard could be beneficial in that way. but also just overall Quillbore feel kind of weird. So we're seeing a Quillbore buff. Prepare yourselves, this one is massive. Our Moonbacon Jazzer is going from tier 3 to tier 2. It is losing a little bit of stat line, going from a 2-5 to a 1-3, but being able to buff your gems that early may make them much more viable. Quillbore have consistently been one of my favorite builds in the last meta, and especially ever since they got the ability to buff their gems, I've really loved them, and so far in spells I haven't, so I'm very excited for this. Up next we have one of our new Quillbore that I tried to play once and I kind of didn't really love this one. It's the Paint Smudger. This is moving down to a tier 3, losing some stats at 3-2, but still the same effect of whenever you cast a Tavern spell, play a blood gem on another friendly Quillbore. I didn't personally play this a lot when it was on tier 4. I'm hoping that making it on tier 3 makes it a little bit better, a little easier to play, maybe some earlier game tempo. I'm not sure how many Tavern spells you're playing, but even just getting 2 or 3 extra gems, and especially now that the Jazzer is on 2, that could be pretty beneficial for some board buffs and some tempo. And now we have another one of our new Quillbore, which has a very fun name. This is Geomagus Roogug. This used to be on tier 5, now it's on tier 4 with the exact same effect and stat line. Similar to the Paint Smudger, I'm hopeful that Roogug may see... I can't take myself seriously when I say his name. Okay, similar to our Paint Smudger, I'm very hopeful that we can see a little bit more play from this minion being on tier 4, maybe being a more mid-game tempo-centric piece as opposed to tier 5 being closer to, oh, this is what I'm going to be playing at the end of the game. There may be viable strategies for this to move into a piece there as well. I've seen it used with Bristlebach, but let's hope that this sees a lot more play now. This is probably my favorite Quillbore change. This is for the Snarling Conductor. It did lose 1 attack going from a 5-5 to a 4-5, but it discards a spell to gain 4 gold. Anything that gives me more economy, I'm a fan of, and I already kind of liked the Snarling Conductor as it is, so I think that this is going to be a great board piece. I'm very excited for this one. I could also see this being used even in a Nala build, which, you know, right now a Quillbore that I like to keep when I play that kind of spell menagerie build is the Bramble Witch, but Bramble Witch could take the elemental spot, and this could have the Quillbore spot just because of the amount of economy. It can really last you into the end game, it truly can. I may be getting ahead of myself, but I'm very excited for that change. Next up, we have a nerf to Bristlebach. This seems to address specifically that situation I talked about with the Taunted Tough Tusk Bristlebach build. Now, it's almost like a Taunted Deflecto, but better than a Taunted Deflecto because it's based on an Avenge instead of just a spawning. So with Deflecto, you do have those little moments of weakness where something needs to die so that the next thing can attack, die, spawn more things. But with this build, all things need to do are just die. So you can just have a bunch of undead at the front of your board. You can have a bunch of beasts at the front of your board. Anything that spawns more minions and has pretty low attack and health value. But this change to Bristlebach is now an additional attack, but Avenge 2. So no longer can you just lock that shield on the Tough Tusk where it gets attacked, and then something dies, and it gets attacked with the shield again, something dies, and so on and so forth till your whole opponent's board just dies to your Tough Tusk. That cannot happen anymore with Avenge 2. That being said, Bristlebach is still perfectly viable, but that Tough Tusk Bristlebach comp seems not broken anymore, which I am a big fan of this change. Throughout this video, I've talked a little bit about, you know, that early tempo, especially when we were talking about dragons, and now we are going to talk about Naga with the Reef Riffer. Sometimes finding a Reef Riffer and a Lava Lurker is just perfect on turn 3, and you can really get some tempo snowballing, and honestly, sometimes it starts snowballing out of control for your opponents. So Reef Riffer is receiving a little bit of a health decrease going from a 1-2 to a 1-1, creating a board liability spot. That being said, it already was one of those, and now it's even more so one of those. But I'm not sure how much it's going to impact that tempo that you can very early receive from this minion. I think it is a good change, however, and I'm excited to see it in play. Up next, we have the Nerubian Deathswarmer. We're talking about undead. This was one I was pretty interested to see on the list as well. It does get a little bit of a health increase, so it is now a 1-4 instead of a 1-3. This does make it feel a little bit better to play, and when you play it, of course, it gets to be a 2-4 because of that battle cry. And overall right now, our undead are very much like die, spawn, die, spawn, die, spawn. So giving this a little more health is interesting. It is not one of those units to die, spawn, but it does feel better as a standalone piece than it did before. Overall, the state of Undead is vastly different than it used to be, and I'm pretty interested to see how this plays into that. Next from Undead, we have the Mummifier. Mummifier is seeing a little bit of a stat line increase going from a 3-2 to a 5-2. Early on in when these new Undead were announced, we did make the notice that Mummifier has that different friendly Undead reborn situation, so you can't infinitely just create more Mummifiers. But that being said, I think the Mummifier already was a decent unit for what it had to offer, and I think that this will be just fine with a little bit more increased of an attack line, so you don't feel so bad with the potential board liability, especially if you don't get the reborn that you want. Up next, we have a minion that I was very excited for. This is Moroes for the Undead. Moroes went from a 6-2 to a 6-1, so lost that health, which doesn't really matter for Death Rattle, but now gives attack as well. It gives +2/+6 instead of just +6 health. That additional attack value goes a long way, and in the kind of Moroes Kel'thuzad interaction, similar to Sister Death Whisper in a way, I think that this will be much more beneficial with that additional attack. I already thought Moroes was really good, but maybe now we can see more of that new Undead board that we have to offer here with the Kel'thuzad, with the Moroes, a lot of our new Undead units. We have the Devouring aspect. I think I'm pretty hopeful for this. Next up, we have the Grave Gobbler. The Grave Gobbler is seeing a change of 3-4 to 4-3 and now gaining +5/+5. It was a little bit of a weird board piece because you did put an Undead next to it on turn 3 and it grew and grew and grew, and then by turn 12 you're like, oh, this is here now, and I have no way of scaling it outside of my other board scaling that I'm already doing. So I'm curious to see how this change will impact. Maybe it'll be such a great board piece that you'll be like, yeah, this is part of my board. But I don't know, we'll see. Next for Undead, we have Kel'thuzad. Kel'thuzad is getting a buff, and I'm pretty sure, I don't know the statistics on this, but I can't imagine that Kel'thuzad saw more play with Undead than with Phalanx. Plenty of people playing Kel'thuzad next to Phalanx, and why not? It's a fantastic utilization of what Kel'thuzad has to offer, but now being at a 10-8 instead of a 7-4, maybe we'll see a few more Undead boards around. I know Undead Summoner boards have been plentiful, but not so much so a whole build of the new stuff, which I think that there is one that exists, and every now and then I see one of them, but this hopefully will assist in making those more viable. All this talk about Phalanx, and here it is getting a bit of a nerf. We already saw Phalanx get one nerf, and now it is getting yet another nerf, going down to a 4-4 giving +4/+4. I've talked about how fantastic this unit is. I really love it. I love the all-typed minions always, and especially the Death Rattle that comes with this one is really, really good. And considering what Kel'thuzad has to offer, we have the chicken, we have Niuzao, but you can't do the broken interaction that I talked about before. With all of those units, do I have something on my mind right now? I guess I do. But really great with Nala builds as well. I think that this is a fantastic unit. And even with this nerf, I think that it's going to be perfectly viable. Moving on now to our spells, we have Lantern Light. This is going from 2 gold to 1 gold. It's basically a Reef Riffer and a spell, but without the body on the board, but a 1/1 body on the board isn't that much better. So this feels pretty great as a big change to a Lantern Light. Up next, we have Staff of Enrichment. Where Lantern Light saw a buff, Staff of Enrichment is seeing a nerf, giving +1/+2 instead of +2/+2. This already felt like Elemental without the body on the board and the ability to rebuff the battle cry, so this feels okay. I haven't played this one too much unless I just received it from something else, so I don't know. We're gonna have to vibe this one out. Next is Fleeting Vigor. I will be the first to say I played this a lot more than I thought I was going to. At 1 gold, it's just really useful. And now it gives +6/+6 instead of +5/+5. It did move up to tier 4, so if you are on tier 4 and you're only seeing 1 spell per shop, it does feel a little bit bad, but it still is only 1 gold, which leaves you plenty of gold to play the rest of your turn. I think this is a good change. Next up, we have Echoing Roar. This spell is like the Gruul Dark Moon spell, and it is going from 2 gold to 3 gold. It was very, very powerful at 2 gold. Quite a lot of stats for a very low cost. So I think at 3 gold that this is perfectly fine. Now we have the insta-buy spell, aka Armor Stash. Armor Stash at 2 gold, in my opinion, was too good. 2 gold, too good. Now it's at 3 gold, and I still think that this is a perfectly reasonable amount of gold to pay for this spell, and the one and only healing option in Battlegrounds right now, ever, actually. There are plenty of times where I find myself going to 5 specifically so I can potentially find this spell, and I think that this is very, very good and reasonable, and this spell is one of my favorites. Next up, we have a pretty important change here. We've got Buddy Up. Buddy Up was almost an insta-buy at 3 gold for me because memes, but also now it's moved to 4 gold. I think that I would still buy this. But a very big change here where piloted Whirlotron has been removed from this pool. So the Lighter Fighter Exodia and just all of the broken interactions with Chicken and other death rattles is no longer a thing, which I think is very healthy for this game. Now we have our tier 6 spell, Sacred Gift. This was already a premium spell at 5 gold. Now it's going to 6 gold. I'm not sure if any spell costs 6 gold. I will be the first one to say that I usually downplay Divine Shields. I call them George cosplays because George is one of my least favorite heroes because I'm like, you know, this is very counterable with a Tunnel Blaster. But that being said, this spell is something that I've bought many a time. So I think that it's a very useful unit. I don't know about 6 gold though. It really depends. But by that time, usually you're hoping that you have at least 1 spell generating minion. So whenever you are offered a Sacred Gift, you will always accept it. Last but not least, here we have some minion pool updates. Dolphin Navigator is leaving, as well as Cold Light Seer, Sore Loser, and General Dracasath coming back. So Cold Light Seer was the Murloc that gave +2 health, and it's returning as a tier 2 minion. So interested to see how that goes, especially with our old faithful Swampstriker with a little bit more health to start. Maybe we have a little early Murloc comp, potentially. Sore Loser seems like a pretty interesting re-inclusion because it was that undead that gave the attack equal to the Tavern tier to your other undead units. And sometimes that extra attack was really not fun to face. And this doesn't really play into the die, resummon situation. It does in the way that you play it at the back of your board. It is counterable by Niuzao, by Anchor. There's a few ways to remove this minion if you don't want to have to get through a whole board to do it. I'm kind of curious to see how that changes the undead landscape because it absolutely will. And we had our Outback Smolderer, but General Dracasath is back, which is the battle cry that provides you with the Smolder Wings. So our Smolder Wing printer is back with the Rylak build. Just having a battle cry dragon is pretty interesting to have back in. I don't know about any of you, but I've played a few Caligos builds, and I will say it's felt a lot less good with spells in because battle cries just don't feel as viable, even with the battle cry spells, like discovering a battle cry, triggering a battle cry, Brand's Blessing if you don't have room for a Brand. There's a lot of support there, but for some reason, I just haven't found myself really succeeding with a Caligos build. So hopefully this brings a little bit of strength back to that. And there we go. Those are all of the changes here in this patch. Like I said, super massive patch. I was trying really hard to make this video not very long. However, here we are. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments of all of the changes, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching. Bye, everyone.